Saturday but here at 12:30? 12.
At 12, we're going to eat.
Okay. 12 to 1:30-ish, and then out there at 2. Okay.
Are we just doing desserts? Is that right? Or are we
Yes,
doing-
Subway sandwiches and desserts.
And then we're bringing in
So
some.
we've got like a small.
All right. I'm going to throw a map up.
Let me know if
And, yeah, you probably can't read any of that. Maybe if I turned out that light, that might help. Is that better?
Yes.
Is that a scientific number, or you just grabbed that one? All right. Right pretty much in the middle, there is a little bitty pinkish red strip. Can you see that? Little pinkish, let me see if I'll point at it. Right there. That's Israel, that little red strip. And then down to the southwest, you can see Egypt. Out to the east, Iraq and Iran, Turkey up here, and then Russia. Ukraine is right in here, Georgia is right in this area. So I wanted to go over and read Ezekiel 38, and it goes into 39 as well. But the theme is that God is going to use Gog against itself. He's going to bring Gog into battle with Israel and then wipe them out. That's the gist of the prophecy in Ezekiel 38, 39. If you go all the way back, you can find Gog as a descendant of one of Noah's 3 sons, Japheth. So if you go to Genesis 10 and those genealogies, you can find the name. But just the identity of Gog becomes kind of the byword. It's the ultimate enemy of God, and God's going to take care of Gog. It comes to represent all of the evils of the world in some contexts. So I just want to read the first few verses and kind of get a taste of it, because just current news is interesting as it has to do with some of this. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog. And you've heard people talk about Gog and Magog. The chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen, fully armed, and a great horde of large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets. Also Gomer with all of its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all of its troops, the many nations with you. And the idea is I'm going to bring you to Israel, and then I'm going to wipe you out. Look down in verse 8. After many days you will be called to arms. In future years you will invade a land that has been recovering from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They had been brought out from the nations, and now all of them live in safety. You and all of your troops and the many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day, thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme. You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and without bars. Of course, the outcome is God gets them up there and they attack, and then God wipes them out. So there's the sense that there has to have this battle, and this battle will take place as they're coming against this people of Israel, who for years the land was desolate, nobody lived there, and then from all over the world they came back. Well, when did all of Israel come back? Anybody? UN declared they were a sovereign nation in 1947. So in 1947, you start having the big movement for Jews to move back to Israel. During the 60s and 70s, without any problem, you could donate money to fly folks from other nations to Israel if you wanted to help repatriate a Jew. There were lots of folks who were handling that kind of thing to get as many Jewish people from all over the world to get back to Israel as they possibly could. How peaceful has that been? Not at all, right? I wrote down a couple. Well, first let's point out some of the names. Beth Targama, that's actually southern Turkey. Persia is Iran. Put is, I forgot what Put is. Cush is Egypt. And down in this, Put is down around Libya, right? So you've got basically the coast of Africa, you've got Egypt, you've got Iran, Iraq, Turkey. All these folks that surround Israel are on this list of folks that are supposed to come up and join in with Gog. So if you are a premillennialist, the last 70 years has been a windfall. Just everything in the world that points toward one great big battle somewhere around Israel has been there constantly. Let's skip the next slide. Down on one of the slides, maybe I'm missing a slide. There is a lineage of conflicts, particularly with Egypt. Think back 1957, I think. Egypt closed the Suez Canal. Anybody old enough to remember that? They closed the Suez Canal, so Israel attacked Egypt. They were able to eventually come to a ceasefire. Then in 1967, Egypt and forget who all was with them. Egypt, Jordan, and I don't think it was Turkey. Anyway, several nations surrounding Israel attacked them. Syria was in on it. Yeah. So there was what they call the 6-Day War, which Israel was victorious. And depending on who wrote the article, if they're pro-Israeli, then you get one side of the story. If they're pro-Egyptian, you get the other side of the story. But again, lots of turmoil, lots of friction between Egypt and Israel, between Syria and Israel, and of course in our day and age, Iran, who's one of the nations on that list, and Israel. So think December of 21, last month, there was a statement made by one of the leaders of Mossad, the secret police of Israel, that they would never allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, and he made a lot of other statements about what he thinks is going on, etc. And so there was a real crisis going on. The U.S. had to step in and negotiate and keep from having a war between Iran and Israel, and that's been only in the last couple of months. There's a constant friction. Does anybody remember when there was finally a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt? One of the guys, if you look at a list of presidents who were not fantastic, he's always on that list. Okay? Jimmy Carter in 1979 got him to come to Camp David, and they finally made a pact between Israel and Egypt that seems to have held up fairly well in the meantime. When the Islamic Brotherhood is in power in Egypt, there's a lot more friction. It just kind of depends on who's the leading figures in Egypt at the time, and really who's the leading figures in Israel at the time as well. If there's a Zionist leader in Israel, then they tend to push a lot of buttons around the area as well. But anyway, I just thought that that was interesting considering what we're talking about. Chapter 39 talks about the same thing. But let's go over to Revelation, chapter 19. And we left off at the end of the 1,000-year reign. And so we have in verse 7, let's go to 20 in verse 7. We have this 1,000-year period, and at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is released from his prison for a short period of time. Okay, when the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog. All right, so again, if you are a premillennialist, then you're looking at Gog and Magog, all of these nations to the north and the south and close east of Israel, and you're saying, okay, there's going to be a battle of Armageddon. It's all going to happen right here. It's all of these nations are going to attack. All of those things get worked into it because of that passage we looked at in Ezekiel.
So the passage in Ezekiel talking about the same gathering as it's talking about here in Revelation?
Well, it's possible, but not necessarily absolute. The nation of Israel Jerusalem itself has been completely destroyed twice. And both times it's been rebuilt. We're on, I guess you would say, the third reincarnation, right? It was torn up, it was rebuilt, it was torn up, it was rebuilt, and now it's flourishing, but this ingathering from all over the world has been pretty monumental since the 40s. Lots and lots of people have moved. It's one of the ongoing problems has to do with land that was taken during the Six-Day War from Palestine. And so you've got Palestinians who were displaced. Israel took the land. And so you've got the settlements on the West Bank. And so the reason that the Palestinians are sending missiles into Israel is that they feel like they deserve to have that land. That was their land prior to the UN intervening and all those sorts of things. So that's an ongoing hot spot. But the more Israelis that move from other parts of the world, the more neighborhoods they need. And so they're still expanding to some degree. It could refer to returning from Babylon. Ezekiel was written prior to Babylonian captivity. He also talks about the building of the third temple. Right? So some people say, well, maybe we're talking about Herod's temple, but a premillennialist would say, no, there'll be the big battle, and then they'll rebuild the temple in modern-day Jerusalem, and Jesus will come and reign for 1,000 years in that place. So this is that part of the writing that I told you there's always some part that doesn't fit well for whatever system you choose. For me, this ingathering and this battle, it's easy to just pass over it for me and say, well, the bad guys lose, the good guys win. The point of this passage is not the battle. The point of this passage is that Satan gets thrown into hell. But on the way to Satan being thrown into hell, you go through all of these other things. Gog and Magog, they gathered them for battle. In number, they're like the sand on the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth, surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves, but fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil, who deceived them, was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and forever. So we got rid of the woman riding the beast. We got rid of the prostitute. Then we had a kind of a battle. They gathered together at Armageddon. The conquering hero with the sword that came out of his mouth vanquished them, threw them into the lake of fire. And now Satan has tried to bring together Gog and Magog and all these armies, surround the city of Jerusalem. They get wiped out and Satan gets thrown into hell. The point is that the oppressor, the persecutor, is finally gone. So again, if you're reading it from the first century viewpoint, the folks in Ephesus in 100 AD reading this would not have immediately said, oh, he's talking about Iran, and he's talking about Russia, and maybe he's talking about, it talks about those from the far north. The far north in that passage is Beth Targama, which is Asia Minor and Turkey. And then they say, well, the far north, he must be talking about Russia, which is another few thousand miles to the north, or even China, which is another few thousand miles north and east. So they take the great armies of China and Russia. Well, why do they choose China and Russia?
They're the ones that we fear and have problems with today.
There you go. They're common to us. We know them now. So when the folks in Ephesus would have read this, they're thinking Turkey. They're thinking, the surrounding area. They're probably not thinking Russia. In the 70s and 80s in particular, Russia was the thing. Right? Once Reagan was in office, one of the things he wanted was to, completely disassemble the USSR. It was still United Soviet Social Republic, is that right? Anyway, USSR, which meant it wrapped all the way around, all the way to Eastern Europe, right? So, because the eastern side of Berlin was part of that. The Iron Curtain was just that whole section. And it was everything to the north of Israel. So Reagan saw that as a threat to the Middle East, as a threat to Israel. So he was very interested in dismantling the USSR, not just for reasons of our security, but he was very interested in Israel. The same thing was true about the Bush family. Very interested in Israel's, health and welfare. So there has been, at least to a small degree, a feeling among the leadership in America that those who are on the side of Israel win and those that are against Israel lose. And it's these passages that are kind of held dear to that. And it really is because that a lot of folks view the Revelation from a premillennial viewpoint, and they're looking for one big final battle, and it makes more sense for some superpower to be the adversary, right? We'll meet you in Jerusalem, right? You bring yours and we'll bring ours, and we'll meet you in Jerusalem. In the last few years, Iran has become a candidate for all of those things for a couple of reasons. A, it's Islamic, right? So we're not fighting against the atheists, the communists as much in our generation as we have fought against the Islamists. So since Iran is an Islamic republic, then they must be bad guys already because they're Islamic. And not too long ago, I want to say his name is Ahmadinejad, something like that, made the statement that Israel does not deserve to exist, and as soon as we have the weaponry, we're going to blow them up. So, when you say things like that, people pay attention to you, right? So Iran has tried to establish itself as a superpower, and they've gone a long way toward that in the last 50 years or so. And people are paying attention to them. They're not missing the point. And again, last month, Israel was close to going to war with them because they are developing nuclear weapons. And Israel has been told, when we get one, we're sending it to you. So it's an ongoing struggle. But I don't think we're necessarily trying to find a group of countries to come and fight in Jerusalem. I think we're still looking at the white hats versus the black hats, the good guys versus the bad guys. And Satan now has been taken out of the picture. He's gone. But as soon as he's gone, we get to the great white throne judgment, which is so end of days. It's very much a last judgment kind of passage that it's hard to say that the two aren't closely connected, right? Satan gets thrown into hell. That means he's not coming back. Right? So there's no more evil. There's no more persecutor on the planet. There's nobody to push persecution on the planet. If he's gone, well, that's the end, right? Jesus comes back, end of time, we have the judgment. That's why Satan's no longer a thing. If there was a time in history when you could just get rid of Satan and humanity would just be happy and move on with history, that would have been nice. Turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, people thought that's what was about to happen. As the industrial age came in, lots of folks thought, well, we're just going to make a utopia and we'll cure all the diseases and we'll fix all the problems and life will be grand. And this is the beginning of that 1,000-year reign that God told us about. We're going to just usher it in. And then we had World War I, the war to end all wars that didn't. And then we had World War II, where we were going to get rid of evil and establish righteousness, but didn't. And then we had Korea, and then we had Vietnam, and then we had the Gulf. And it all just keeps going. So you can't look at the 20th century and say, we got it right. Now life is good, Satan's gone. So if Satan is still here, then it seems like chapter 20 cannot be completely fulfilled, at least in the literal sense. So, again, this is the point in Revelation where my understanding that it's all about that persecution in the first century wanes in its ability to explain everything. Well, let's look at the white throne judgment real quick. Beginning in 20 and verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Okay, how many times does it tell you where you're going if you're not in the book? 3 or 4 times, right? Keeps repeating that same phrase over and over. The lake of fire. Who is in the lake of fire so far? Right? So the devil is there. The Roman authority, Roman emperor worship, Rome itself, all in hell. If we've got the right interpretation of who the beasts are, etc., then all of that is gone. Right? So there's no more persecution. There's no more persecutor. And so we get to the judgment. And in the judgment, again, the question is, who do you belong to? Right? So you have all of these books that are opened. Let me do that. Yeah, there we go. And all of the dead, small and great, are brought in. The sea gives up all the dead that are in it. In other words, if you ever lived, ever died, you're there. There's no exception to those who are called into this judgment. And then it says that books are opened. So you have not a singular book, but books. Some people interpret this as being Scripture. You're judged against Scripture. Jesus said, the words that I speak, they will judge you in the last day. But this actually says that the dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. So it's not a recording of God's message to man. It's a recording of man's response. So what kind of life did you live? What things did you do? They're all recorded in these volumes and volumes of books. Again, literal or figurative? I mean, it's possible that there are that many billions of books to represent all the people who have ever lived. Right now, there's about 7.5 billion of us on the planet. So if each one of us, had a rendition of ourselves in a book, yeah, this is the heavenlies. This is God's viewpoint of things. So, no, it talks about books as if they're literal, but again, I think this is figurative. Everything that you've ever done is known, right? It's right there. You can't deny it. Have you ever known somebody that was a really, really good liar? I mean, they could look you in the eye and just tell you an absolute lie, and if you didn't know better, you just never know. There is no one who has ever lived. I'm not sure what the total would be, including our generation and going all the way back. We've had such a population explosion, I would think it probably wouldn't be more than 10 billion total. So if there's that many people, there's zero out of that many people who can fool God. He knows absolute truth. So all of the everybody is there before the great white throne judgment. But what is the difference between being cast into the lake of fire and being redeemed? Everyone's name who is not written in the Lamb's book of life was thrown alive into the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. So if you're not written in the Lamb's book of life, you go where Satan and the beasts went. If you are written in the Lamb's book of life, you don't. That's the thing. So, here's your book of all the stuff you did, and some of it's good and some of it's bad and some of it may be horrible. But right there in the Lamb's book of life is your name. And if your name is here, all of this stuff is not the criteria. Right? It matters, but it doesn't matter as much as the fact that you belong to the Lamb. Now, we looked in the middle of the book at the difference between having the 666 as your marking or being marked as the Lamb, as a follower of the Lamb. Here's the final outcome of that. Right? All of those folks who were connected to Satan, who were part of just the world in general, they're all the 666ers. It doesn't matter if you weren't actively persecuting, you were on that side of the aisle. On our side, it doesn't matter if you're the greatest evangelist that ever lived. You're not the Apostle Paul, you're not the Apostle Peter, but your name is in the Lamb's book of life. So you're marked with the Lamb, which means you're on this side of the aisle. It's all about to whom do you belong. These folks don't belong to Christ, so they get thrown into the lake of fire. The ones who belong to Christ are then kept with Christ. So, and I always tell myself, and I don't want to leave this passage without giving a little homage to a teacher that I had years and years ago. He was an elder in the church. He had a doctorate in biblical studies, and I think probably in biblical languages. He was my teacher for this on the undergrad level, Revelation. I don't remember much about the class other than, with all of his knowledge and all of his abilities, he would come to class wearing bib overalls. And when he would quote scripture, first he read from the Greek and translated as he went. So he was way out of my league. But he would put a thumb up under that bib overall, and he would start rocking back and forth. And he would put his hand up like that and look at the back corner of the room like there was an angel with cue cards back there. And I can remember this passage. Behold, I saw a great white throne. I'll never forget it. He was a great man. He'd been gone a while. But the whole earth and the sea and everybody in them has to show up for this moment in time. And whether there's a big war that leads up to it, it all turns out the same. Christ, the Lamb, is in charge. He always has been. He always will be. And when the end comes, those who belong to the Lamb will be ushered into an eternal existence that will be fantastic. And those who do not belong to the Lamb will be sent to the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So when you're reading through and you see, so-and-so did such and such, they will not be harmed by the second death. It's referring to this fire and brimstone lake, which Jesus refers to as Gehenna in his preaching, and we just generally call hell. Right? Chapters 21 and 22 are all about the good stuff that we get if our name's in the Lamb's Book of Life. So after all of this is done and all the dead have been judged, John gets to see the new stuff, the good stuff that God is giving to the people that belong to him. Two more passages. I can't let you go yet. Exodus 32:32. Exodus 32:32. Just interesting Old Testament references to the book of life. Moses is talking to God, and God has had enough of the Israelite people. And so Moses goes back up to the Lord, and he says, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. Remember the situation, the golden calf? But now, please forgive their sin, but if you will not forgive them, then blot me out of the book you have written. So even in the Exodus, even in Moses' time, there was this sense that God had a list, and you wanted to be on that list. And Moses belonged to God. And Moses says, if you're going to get rid of all the Israelites, just mark my name out too. Right? Look at Daniel chapter 12. We were just in Ezekiel, it's right next door. They prophesied in roughly the same time frame. Look at Daniel chapter 12, and we'll look at just the first two verses. Talking about the end of time, or the end times. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. So, lots of bad stuff is coming, but how do you get delivered from the bad stuff? Well, your name's on the list. So, this idea goes all the way back to Moses. Daniel writes about it. Old Testament prophets wrote about it. The people in Jesus' day would have recognized that figure of speech. Your name is in the Lamb's Book of Life. And finally, it stops being just the book and ends up being the Lamb's book. In my life, being on somebody's list wasn't always a good thing. Right? I have been told by more than one person, you're on my list. And they didn't mean it was a good thing. They meant you're in a big trouble, buddy. But when you're on Jesus' list, it's a good thing all the way. Any questions, thoughts on any of that? Yes, ma'am?
We still don't know how to get in the book, right?
How to get in the book? Revelation doesn't talk about it other than these people were faithful even if it caused them their death. So when you're talking about the Lamb's Book of Life in Revelation, you're talking about those who have come through the persecution. But in general, to be in Christ is to be on his list. Right? So you talk about things like faith and conversion and baptism and those things that, you're baptized into Christ, you put on Christ. There's not a passage that I'm aware of that says at baptism your name is put on the list. The closest you'd come might be to in Acts 2, that the Lord was adding to the church daily those that were being saved. And so you might think of that in terms of having your name, put on the list. But that concept, they understood that concept. You had to choose sides. You couldn't just be in the middle. You had to decide, am I for the culture? Am I for the emperor? Am I for random religion? Or am I specifically for the one true God and Jesus, his son? You had to make that choice. And sometimes in doing so, you got on somebody else's list. You got in a lot of trouble, and some of them lost their lives because of it. But I think when you run it all together, we've been looking all the way through Revelation at people who were being persecuted by one side and supported by the other. And so as these are marked with the mark of the beast, the 144,000 are marked by the mark of their God. And then you have those that are following the beasts into battle versus those that are following the rider on the white horse into battle. There's always an us versus them. And so you could trace backwards and say, well, all those souls that were under the altar in the fifth seal, their names are on the list. Right? Those folks are definitely in the Lamb's Book of Life. Those that did not love their lives until the end, who are faithful unto death, definitely their names written in the Lamb's Book of Life. I was trying to remember if, that's good homework. We'll take a look before next week. In the 7 letters to the 7 churches, is the list, the Lamb's Book of Life, is it one of the rewards? One of the rewards is, I'll give you a stone with a name written on it that nobody knows. One of them was, I'll give you the right to the tree of life. So there's references to being in the heavenlies. I'll give you the right to sit down with me in my throne as I've sat down with my Father in his throne. So there's stuff that says definitely that they were saved, but I don't think it specifically says to any of them, and I'll write your name down in the book of life. But it'd be a good something to look at. Anybody else? Thoughts? Nope. Okay. Rambled a little bit tonight, but there's just tons and tons of interesting stuff that surround that white throne judgment and the final episode of Satan finally being thrown into the lake of fire. That should bring cheers from the folks in Ephesus, don't you think? As somebody's reading through and they get to the part where they say, and then the dragon was taken and thrown into the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. I mean, that finally you've done something to relieve us of all these things they've done to us. All right. Well, I'll see you guys later. Talk to you.